Hello?
Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi, Julio. Nice to meet you. Here.
Oh, again.
Is anyone hearing me?
Yes.
Can anyone hear me? Great.
Yes.
Okay. I'm trying to fix
Yes,
my
got it.
camera. For some reason, it's not working. Oh, there you go. Okay, good. Okay. So it's one of those days where everything doesn't work as planned. So my computer doesn't want Zoom to be working properly. So I'm using the web one. So help me out here. I am going to pause.
This meeting is being recorded.
Well, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the June session of the tbotalent Forum. While we are still waiting for the rest of the people to connect, we are going to make a brief presentation of this month's session, in which we are going to be speaking, not we, but the experts. The title of this session is Speak the Quality and Standards Language, your key to unlocking global business opportunities. We are going to start with a presentation by David Huebel. He is the president at Orion Assessment Services. That is a company that works as an independent standards auditing firm that specializes in certifying and accrediting organizations to corporate, national, international, and internal standards. They say they serve the language service industry, also language education, and other industries like information technology and transportation. As the president of Orion, David's role is to educate and help organizations understand the benefits of certification to national or international standards. So, David, the mic is all yours now.
Great, thank you. So I hope everybody can hear me right now. So I'm looking forward to taking you through today's session, and thank you for joining us. And just let me do a quick screen share here. So the topic for today, of course, is unlocking global business opportunities by using standards. So what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to, first of all, take you through the standards, because unless you know what the standards are all about, you don't know how to use them to unlock the opportunities. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the standards. Then secondly, we're going to talk a bit about how to use these standards to help you unlock potential business opportunities. So as part of this, I'm going to run through the most common standards, and these are ones you've probably seen, posted on buildings, you've seen it on others' websites. And the most common standards here, first of all, on the top, are what we call management system standards. So you have ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO 45001, and ISO 27001. So the ISO standards, they're international standards. They were created by the International Organization for Standardization. And like any standards, when you put the standards together, they're developed by a cross-functional group, which includes people from your own industries. They include those from, government, purchasers of them, and independents. So a whole lot of people go into creating these various standards. So the second group of standards that we have down in the bottom right hand are what we call industry or sector specific standards. So unlike those ones, the ones on the top, again, are management system standards. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take you through some of the common themes for them. So when you're dealing with management system standards, they deal with the whole organization. Now, the ISO standards that you saw on the top, like the 9, the 14, and 45, they apply to all sectors, all organizations. So anybody can do it. It's not specific to language service sectors. And what they are is they're management system standards. So they deal with how the whole organization runs. So basically, it starts from the very top and it follows the plan, do, check, and act philosophy. So you establish and set up goals and objectives. You put the resources into whatever product or service you're trying to fulfill. You define your processes, you implement them, you monitor, measure them, you follow them. And so it's an overall management system standard. And just to give you an idea, all the ISO standards that you look at, they're very common in structure. So it doesn't matter what the focus is. And what I've showed you right here is there's two standards, the ISO 9001, which is a quality one, and the ISO 27001, which is an information security standard. So if you just shoot down the index there, you can see they're exactly the same. So you have 4 as context of the organization, then you have leadership, you have planning, support, and operations. So when you dive into these standards, you'll see whatever they are, when they're an ISO management system standard, they look all the same. But of course, there's a different focus to them. So when you're dealing with ISO 9001, it's a quality focus. So at the end of the day, it really focuses on your processes, your systems, which relate to the customer. So it's like, how do you deliver a quality product and a quality service and deliver that to the customer? The next one that you have is the ISO 14001. So the spinoff on that one is it's environmental. So it's an environmental focus. And actually in the language service sector, I've had a number of companies request environmental. So it looks like that's starting to work its way into some of the RFPs as well. Then the next one, ISO 45001, is health and safety. So it's exactly what it sounds like. Is part of running your organization, you probably have a health and safety program in place to help protect your workers. The last one that you see on the bottom there is the ISO 27001. Now I'll talk about that one a little bit afterwards, but that's for information security. And to be honest, that's a pretty commonly requested standard at this point in time. And what I'm doing is I'm seeing those in a lot. I'm getting a lot of requests for that one right now for people who deal with government, they deal with financial institution. Anybody that deals with sensitive information, we're finding that they are requesting those in a lot of the RFPs if you want to work with them. Now, with the information security management system, again, it's a management system standard. So what it does on the left-hand side there, you see, is it has a management system and administration portion to the standard. Then it requires companies to do a risk assessment. So look at all the information security risks that you have associated with what you do. And lastly, on the right there, you can see as part of this standard, this one's a little bit different because it actually has 93 controls that you have to follow that relate to information security. So it's everything from physical security in the building. If you do have a building, you're not virtual. You know, do you have badge access? It deals with people control, so things like making sure employees that work with you have background checks. It has infrastructure controls, of course, or technological controls, which relate to accessing password access to your system, you know, cryptography. So there's a whole slew of items in there. But again, ISO 27001, it's a management system standard. Now, the next ones we get into here are some of the other standards I mentioned. And so what these are is they're sector-specific standards. They're the more specific to the organization itself. So on the left-hand side, you'll see probably one of the most common ones that we see is ISO 17100, which is for translation. The next one we have there is ISO 18587, which is machine translation post-editing. So it's basically when you put it through the MT, how do you post-edit it on the other side? And then under the interpreting services side of things, you see we have ISO 18841, which is basically a general interpreting standard. We have the ISO 1361, which is more specific to community interpreting. And those two, probably the most popular is 18841 and 13611. Although you do have a couple other standards that we've seen recently come out, but I don't know of anybody that's really certified to those. And that's ISO 20228, which is for legal interpreting. And the one on the bottom, you see ISO 23155 for conference interpreting. Now, the ones I point out here, these are just a handful of standards. I mean, really, there's kind of standards for everything out there. So it makes the whole selecting a standard process a little bit confusing for some. Now, just to give you an idea on how these specific standards work, is I'll take, for example, the ISO 17100. So you can see this standard here. This is just a real high level. It's specific to translation services. So when I look at the way the standard is set up, it basically says you have to put resources into whatever you're trying to achieve through your translation process. This is on the left-hand side. You have a pre-production planning process. So that would be more like how you're looking at the source documentation, how you're quoting it, how you're getting it ready for translation. And then you jump into the production side of things, they call it. So production is your workflow management, essentially. So assigning translators, assigning revisers, you know, managing the workflow. And then lastly, they have post-production, which is number 6 there. So that's once you've been through the translation process, how do you get that all ready and prepare it and send it to your customer? Now, on the right-hand side, you can see as part of this production workflow, which is the middle box, it has various steps that you no doubt recognize. And I apologize if it's a little bit small here, but basically it goes from translation to checking to revision to review, proofreading, and final verification and release to the customer. Now, when you go through the standard itself, the review and proofreading are the only 2 items that are optional. So within the standard, you have to do translation, checking, revision. Now, many people call revision post-editing. So it's basically having somebody that's bilingual look at both the source and target text to make sure that the intent and the translation was done correctly. So that just gives you an idea. And when you go through all the sector-specific standards, they're very much the same. They'll have requirements that are specific to the organization. So now if you do a standard, and we'll talk about how to select them afterwards, but really the next step for any organization is once they have the standard and they've picked it, they have to decide on how they're going to put it together. So the first one is they can implement it internally. Now, a lot of the standards that you see, like the 17100, the sector-specific standards, most organizations I find can go through that and they can do that internally. Now, the other option too is to hire a consultant. So typically consultants, you can do anything internally. It all comes down to time and cost. But really what I do is I see most companies that do the ISO 9000, 1445, they use a consultant, but really that's up to you. And lastly, there's some firms out there that do combinations when they need help. So they might do a training course supplemented by some sort of implementation, training, and consulting. So again, how you prepare is really, you're going to have to get a copy of the standard, look at how complex it is, and basically determine whether or not you can do it yourself. Now, what I mentioned with standards, anybody can implement a standard. It just comes down to, do you have the internal expertise to do it? How much time is involved, and of course, how much cost? Because when you have somebody taking time to put the internal systems in place for you, it might take away from their day-to-day job. So you really have to kind of balance that out and determine what direction you want to go. So I think those three factors you see on this slide are very important. So again, can you do it internally? How much time is involved? And how much cost? So if you're, and cost really ties a lot to your internal cost, or if you hire a consultant, how much money they're going to charge you to do it. Now, once you've implemented, most companies that want to use it for their benefit, they get certified. And so just to give you a quick idea on how the certification works is normally year one is for the ISO standards. We have to do what we call stage 1 and stage 2. So the stage 1 is basically a readiness review. You've implemented it. We have to make sure that it meets the requirements of the standard from the high level. And if everything looks and appears to be in place, what we do is we do stage 2, which is a detailed review. So the detailed review is really where we go through all the requirements of the standard to make sure they've been effectively implemented. And what we do is we interview all those involved. So when you're doing the stage 1 and stage 2, those are only required for the ISO 9001, the ISO 14000, 45, and the cybersecurity. The other specific standards for your industry or the sector specific ones, all we really do is we do the stage 2 audit. Now, in order to maintain your certification after you have it, audits are required in years 2 and year 3. So again, when you're dealing with the ISO 9000, 14, 45, and 27, we have to do a surveillance audit every year. But if we're dealing with just the sector specific standards, what we do is we do those audits every 2 years. Now, and some people are probably going to ask about the cost afterwards, but the cost, I better knock that one off real quickly. So basically, the amount of costs it depends on the size of your organization. So the bigger the organization, the more time the more people we have to talk to as part of the interviews to verify the system's up and running. So the more time is involved. So really, what we do with the standards, it's hard to give a one-fits-all answer. It depends on basically how many people you have within the organization. So assuming that you've been through everything, you've picked a standard, you've implemented it, you really got to know what benefits there are for it. And to be honest, these steps here on how to choose the standard is probably the most important step you have. And you want to make sure this is right. So before you go down the path of implementing everything, which is going to take time and money, you got to make sure you have the right standard. So I talked a bit about some of those, and this is probably the most important part, again, right from the very beginning. So if you want to unlock the global business opportunities, you need to pick the right standard. So the first one that people always pick from is if it's a customer requirement. So if your customer requires it, you have to do it. If you want to bid on new contracts, and you're probably finding a lot more these days of the contracts have a minimum standard requirement, is that you have to, again, go back to it and see if you want to bid on the work or if it's a customer requirement. That's probably the number one opportunity for you, because you might be losing opportunities if you don't have it. The next big reason a lot of companies do the standards, they pick the standards, is based on marketing, competitive advantage, branding, and reputation. So is this something you want to use as a market differentiator? You know, for example, like I deal with a lot of companies that once they get a certification, they might use it and they might influence the writer of the requirements of the RFP to say, this is very important, you should put this in. So essentially what they're doing is they're using this to knock out the competition when it comes to RFPs. Another part is to build trust with customers. So once you're certified, companies know that you have systems and processes in place for achieving quality. The last one I mentioned was exclude the competition. A few other points here that people use when picking standards is risk management and liability protection. So trying to demonstrate due diligence, so they follow the process. You know, they reduce, for example, the potential for information security breaches, and that would be an example of ISO 27001. Ensure processes and approvals are followed. So again, a lot of this is to protect yourself, to make sure things have been followed. So for example, if you have a quality system and you have a certain approval process for putting out an RFQ when it gets above a certain level, maybe that's a control you've built in place. So it helps protect you from people releasing quotes that haven't been approved by a certain level of management. Now, a couple other ones I have in here are framework for continuous improvement. So once you have these systems in place, a lot of the ISO standards require you to do continual improvement and to demonstrate it. So it really forces it right in front of you to say, hey, listen, we got to make some improvements each year to the way that we use and run our business. And a lot of that, when you do an improvement, most of that sort of stuff ties to the bottom line, because if you become more efficient in the way you do things, then obviously there's going to be a time save, which ties to dollars. The last one there is some people use it as well. Like, I don't know about everybody here, but I've had to go down and get cyber insurance. We do it as part of our liability protection. So the questionnaire comes out with a whole bunch of questions. Do you have this in place? Do you have that in place? Or just send us a copy of your ISO certificate and we don't have to ask any more of those questions. So it's a good way as well if you're going for cyber insurance for things like information security or ISO 27001, just to demonstrate that you have that sort of thing in place. So really, again, with the standards here, the standards are all about trying to determine which standard you pick, using that standard to pick which benefit you're going to get. So really, your starting point in summary from everything is you have to pick the right standard based on that criteria that I ran through a few minutes ago. You get certified, you promote your certification, and lastly, what you want to do is once you have the certification, you want to use it to unlock the business opportunities. So those ones, again, being things like bidding on contract, taking the competition out of the RFP writing process, doing your own benefits. So there's a whole slew of things. So again, that's kind of the process that you really want to go through. Now, one of the things to remember too, when you're going through certification, it's not just about complying with standards. It's about demonstrating commitment to excellence and gaining a competitive edge in the global marketplace. And again, gaining the competitive edge is probably the most important thing that you want in the marketplace, because that's the part that you're going to use is helping you win more contracts. And that's it. I think we have I'll leave it now for the next part of the presentation. So thank you, everybody.
That was David Huebel. Thank you very much. And now we are going to have a few minutes before the panel discussion to check if anyone, any of the attendants has any questions for David. Let's see if... Okay, I see Jorgelina wrote something on the chat. Okay, let's leave them for the moment after the panel discussion. We are not going to go to the panel discussion. We are going to have Steve Lank, who is the CEO at Cesco and Linguistic Services. Steve has been working in the language industry for a lot of years now, since 1987, and he worked in many roles as a freelance translator, project manager, and then having some senior management positions with companies in the United States, Ireland, and Spain. From 1998 to 2011, he served as the chairman of the ASTM subcommittee, and he was responsible for developing and publishing the ASTM F2575 standard guide for quality assurance in translation. That was the first standard of its kind in the United States. He's now a technical contract for the update of the standard. We are going to have Liza Blason. She is the continuous improvement manager at TVO. She's been with TVO for over 18 years now. She started here as a project manager and then progressed through roles such as project manager, trainer, leader, operations manager, and currently she is the continuous improvement manager at TVO, leading the company's certification process. She works really hard for us to be holding several standards now. And the moderator of this panel will be Julio Montero. He is the regional director at Megalexis Communication. He's also an international convenor and expert in translation standards at ISO, and he's also a member of the board of directors in the Canadian Language Industry Association. He holds a degree, a master's degree in corporative law from the McGill University. He also a diploma from the Californian State University in professional localization, and a Juris Doctor from Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. Now the whole panel is yours.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Well, see, David Huebel gives us the auditor's perspective, which is very useful. And now Liza and Steve are going to give us the practical perspective of companies that embrace industry regulation. But before we start, I just want to emphasize the difference between government regulation and industry regulation. Government regulation is in the form of laws and regulations that people have no option to comply with, if they apply to them, of course. But in the case of industry regulation, it is strictly voluntary. And in many cases, in the language industry, countries have not too much government regulation around linguistic or language services. So the national and international standards structure come in very handy for companies who want to, get their house in order and pursue excellence. So that brings me to the first question for Liza. Liza, what was the process like in general to get certified, compliant? How did you choose the standards, and what was your approach based on what David explained?
Yeah, thanks, Julio. Well, in our case, it was a request coming from the management, in general, the president, or in some other cases, also just a suggestion by the external auditor at the time of auditing. I don't know, 9001, for example, they suggested 17100 because that's the second one we certified. And actually, in our last certification, one of the suggestions was 27001, which David was also mentioning. So that was a suggestion by the external auditor. So it's a mixture between what is needed, what the management sees, and also the suggestion that we can get from the external auditor. That was in our case at the beginning in 2011. We certified 9001, and then in 2017 we got 17100. And then in 2020, in the pandemic, we acquired the last three. We certified 18587. Also, David mentioned it. The one related to machine translation and pulse editing. Also the CGSB, that is a Canadian standard. It is similar to 17100, but it has some particularities related to resources, mainly human resources linguists. And then the other one is ASTM 3130. Those are the three that we certified in 2020. So at the time being, we have 5 standards that we are working very hard on them. Actually, this year we had a external certification, and then at the end of the year we're going to have another one.
Wow, that's quite an ample suite of standards you have certified under. But did you know that ISO published 2 new standards that are crucial to the language industry this year? And those are 11669 on translation project management and 50-60 on evaluation of translation quality, which leads me to the next question for Steve. Steve, you've been through this process as well, and you are a veteran in terms of national and international standards development. So have you seen any business value in terms of before and after embracing industry regulation and adopting standards?
Well, yes, in my experience, and it's been varied too. It really depends on, as a language services company, what your market is, and sort of what your niche is and what clients are requiring. When I was working in Europe, I worked with a number of, and helped a number of two companies, achieve ISO certification and work through that. And that was very much client driven, and those clients required the certification, right? So it definitely drove business. My experience here in the US, since I've been back since 2008, working mostly in state government work primarily, right? And so those markets have not been as demanding in terms of standards yet, so they're just starting to take them on. And as language access requirements in the US became more and more stringent, people started looking more and more at the standards. So with my US clients, I found that familiarizing themselves with the standards was the important part. As a client education tool, it was great, because certainly in the US, most people that are procuring services, most companies that are procuring services don't have a sense, they don't know the process. Many don't have a second language themselves, so they're looking for something to help guide them. And so I've been working in standards on the STM side since 1998, right? So we've gone through many iterations of F2575, and it finally became a standard practice in 2023, which now makes it certifiable. You can sort of get certified against it. And we are seeing now, as we have been talking to clients about this over time in US, in state and federal government, we're starting to see the ASTM standards and the ISO standards as well required more, quoted more in RFPs. So I think that over time, we'll start to see more business being driven, and there being more requirements that you have the certifications, or at least follow the standards. Whereas before, our challenge was just making people aware that standards existed and that they should choose them. I also find that on the U.S. government, on the U.S. side in particular, companies that are certified to a standard themselves, so companies that comply with ISO standards in whatever their business is, or to ASTM standards, depending on whatever their business or product is, like the certifications because they understand what that means. They understand what you'd had to go through to do it, and it shows to them that you have a quality in place, even if they don't understand what it is you do or can evaluate the quality of the product that you're giving them themselves. The fact that they understand the ASTM process or the ISO process because they've undergone it themselves makes them much more comfortable to work with you.
And that, Steve, is very consistent with the principle of commonality in procurement. So more and more organizations in the public sector, the private sector, and even NGOs, nonprofits, are embracing the principle of doing business with companies that think alike. And embracing standards is one of those things that can help companies match each other. Beyond national borders. Obviously, there are national standards, but there are also international standards that at some point can be, the only link between two organizations or between a buyer and a supplier, like our companies. And that very much speaks to the value of standards and industry regulation beyond process and operation optimization. Which leads me to the next question to Liza. Liza, you already have certifications under the Canadian standard, the US standard, some of the international standards, but there are more international standards coming up. In my personal experience, leading the international standards development process, I just mentioned the new standard for translation project management, and one of the most important ones historically, the standard for evaluation of translation quality. Are you thinking of certifying under more standards in the future? Are you planning on continuing this trend?
Yes, actually, we are getting starting to get acquainted and familiar with 27001. That's the next one we have in mind. But I'm happy to know of those other two that you mentioned. Sounds very interesting, so I'm sure I will have a look at that. And of course, mention that to the management, because there should be of course a coherence in everyone. Everyone wants to go to those standards. So for the moment, that's the one that we have in mind, and it's quite comprehensive. So I think there's a lot of work that near in the future in terms of 27001. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Liza. Yeah, well, TVO is very lucky to have someone like you doing this full time. You know, many companies that David was saying need to engage external help to do this, and that leads me to the next question to Steve. Steve, how did Cesco do it? Did you do it yourself with all your knowledge of standardization? Or did you hire someone, and how was that that journey from zero to receiving that certificate of compliance or registration before several standards?
Well, let me start by saying that in my current company, Cesco, we are just in the process of getting certified, right? So I have been with other certified companies that have been certified in the past, and I've gone through that whole process. And in those cases, we did work with external consultants. This year, F2575, it's now, since it's become a standard practice, we can be certified against it. So we're working towards doing that. It's time for me, as a developer of ASTM standards, to get that certification. We have been compliant with the standards for as long as they've been there, but our clients have not been requiring certification. So we've been taking our time about getting the certificates, but we've decided that this is the year. So it is an interesting process. What I like about the process of preparing for certification is it gets everybody on the same page internally in your company, right? So the process of making sure that everybody's things documented, making sure that everybody knows where everything is, making sure that they know what's an exception and what's a rule, making sure that they understand the standards themselves and understand where there may be gaps. I mean, that to me has been the biggest value, because at the end of the day, I believe our processes work. Our processes, are compliant with ASTM and ISO standards, and I know that we provide quality work as TBO does. But I think these certifications help to show staff, to demonstrate to staff, that you know what you're doing, you are experts in your field, and you do provide quality work, and that standards work. And also, especially when you're working across, now that much of our remote, Cesco used to be all of us in one place. Now we're all over the world, and it's very, very helpful to have this sort of as a common language across the company. So in this particular case, as we are preparing for certification this year, we started out primarily based on my own expertise, but we will consult with somebody outside, simply because I think there's a lot of value in having a third party who's not within your company. It's like for anybody on the call who has kids, you can tell your kids things over and over and over again, and they may or may not do them, even though it's great advice. But as soon as somebody else tells them that, they come back and they say, hey, so-and-so told me I'm going to do it. Doesn't matter where they got the message or why they decided. The important thing is that they do it and understand the value. And I think that that's the value of having somebody come from the outside, not to so much to tell you what to do or how to do it, but for your staff to see somebody from the outside coming in and kind of saying the same thing. So for that reason, I think that there's a lot of value into bringing somebody from the outside, not to tell you what your process is or how you should be doing it, but just the value of process across the board.
It is so true what Steve is saying. Yeah. And let me tell you that in our case, we started in 2011 with an external consultant. And then there was a shift because it was the external consultant. And at that time, I was in charge of the operations. So I had close contact with this person. But it was quite difficult to make people get engaged. So then actually, it was, I think, in 2018, more or less, that's when the continuous improvement team was created, and that's when we kept the external consultant, but we are like the consultants inside the company, and so we are the link, and it's much easier, and the engagement is created by us. And let me tell you that it's not just myself, it's Julia and also Carla in charge of all this internally, apart from the external consultant. And I think that change was vital because that was the way we could understand what the external consultant was saying, and we knew the reality of the company, of the organization, and what people were doing, you know. So that helped a lot because we could have the meetings and get things done, and then it is us, because at the moment we do that actually. We have the meetings with the external consultant, and that gives a lot of result. And what Steve was saying about people doing things because somebody else from outside is coming and suggesting things, and and watching what you're doing. Actually, it's really, it has been it sort of gives positive attitude in people. That's what we noticed. And also, compared to the beginning, what we can see while going through the different standards, when we have the meetings with people, they get more and more engaged. And now they do some things like by themselves. It's not just us trying to organize meetings, and there are some things that for example, we have a specific account for all this. So if people realize that they have to update a process or any documentation that belongs to them, they send us the changes to us, and we are in charge of doing that. So there's no, a lot of movement with the documentation because it's a lot. And that also is really, really positive compared to the beginning, because at the beginning, when I'm telling you that there was just the external consultant, people would go to meetings and say, okay, I'm doing this because you're asking me, but I'm not involved, compared to nowadays. And also we see, of course, that we offer trainings and all that, but we see that people are more conscious about their findings and their risks. And if they find while working that there's a risk, they upload it on a system, which is something that has evolved with time, because at the beginning that wouldn't happen. It was some people from the management uploading risks, and nowadays people who are senior, semi-senior are uploading risks. And that's really, really good. That was a change for the better. Yeah.
Well, that sounds like a very good experience, Lisa. And David, from your experience, do companies go to Orion for gap analysis and consulting assignments on how to prepare, how to embrace, before they call you to, oh, well, get us an audit to get certified? How often do they go to you for gap analysis, and what challenges do you find internally? Do you ever find internal resistance? Human beings always resist to change, and embracing standards in many cases implies change within an organization. So can you share your experience, David, on what you've seen in that transition?
Sure, I can hit it from a couple sides. So just so you know, for us as well, like we're no different than a lot of you. We have to comply with probably about 10 different standards as part of our accreditation. So we're audited annually and everything along those lines. So go through the same process as you do. Now, to answer your question a bit more about the gap assessments. So because we're a third-party audit firm, we're not allowed to consult and tell you how to do things. It's considered an audit. Then if we did that, then the audit wouldn't be arm's length. So basically, what we're allowed to do from our perspective is we can do gap assessments. A gap assessment essentially is going in and telling you, going through the standard, going through a mini audit with you and telling you where the gaps are. But in terms of fixing the gaps, we can't come and say exactly, here's how to fix and close the gap, or we can't consult and work you through closing the gaps. So that's something that you have to do yourself. You have to do with a consultant. So certification bodies, if they're really legitimate, there'll be absolutely zero consulting involved with it, but gap assessments are allowed. So I think now in terms of companies that do that, we have done a handful of gap assessments. To be honest, I tend to find more of the gap assessments are done for the ISO 9001, the 14001, the 45001, the 27. So the management system standards, because those are a lot more bigger. They're a lot more complex. So if I see gap assessments, they happen on that side. If you're doing more of a gap assessment of a sector or standard specific one, I think you can probably do that yourself. So because it's very specific to what you do. I know on our website, we have guidance for that as well for companies. It just tells you how to do a gap assessment. So it starts with taking a copy of the standard, highlighting the shalls and musts, then going through the workflow the way that you do it, and just looking at each requirement of the standard and saying, do we have this covered somewhere within what we do, right? So I always tell people, never write your system to a standard. All you do is you write your process and your system to the way that you do it, and you go back to the standard and you say, are there any gaps that I need to fill in the standards somewhere within my process? And that requirement, if it's missing, you put it wherever it belongs. You don't put it according to this, you don't follow the standard. You follow your workflow. Again, the requirement's missing, you put it in where it belongs. And that's the best way. So with the standards themselves, the easier ones, you can no doubt go through it yourself and you can do the gap assessment yourself. The bigger ones, again, the more complicated ones, you get into the 27001, that's a lot of requirements in there. That's probably something, if you don't have the expertise in-house, you're probably going to find somebody to help you with that.
Thank you, David. And Steve, in terms of the process to develop those standards that then auditors like David need to consult on or audit compliance under. Is there any significant difference that you can tell us about the process for ASTM and ISO? Because sometimes sometimes the audience is thinking, well, maybe if I do business primarily with U.S. companies, maybe the ASTM standard is the ASTM standards are more appropriate, or we have a more international outlook and do more business with European clients. So can you enlighten us about any significant difference between the process in ASTM and ISO?
Well, we'll see about how much I can enlighten you. But you're sort of the ISO expert. From my perspective, I mean, I've worked my whole the last 25 years on ASTM standards. I can tell you that what you're saying about, I mean, it's very much driven by the client. I think that a lot of the standards we have on the ASTM side and the ISO side are very complementary. But I think in a lot of cases, you really need to follow, multiple ones depending on what your clients are looking for. And it's true. In my experience, a lot of clients in Europe are looking at ISO, and more American clients are looking at ASTM, even though really both of them do the job. The big difference I see in the way standards are developed inside of ASTM and ISO is on the ASTM side, these are voluntary consensus standards, meaning that you have to have a balanced group of people developing the standards together, which is why it takes so long. I mean, the first version of F2575 took 8 years to develop, and the recent update that we did that was published in 2023 took another 8 years. You have to have a balance of, and these are all individuals who are involved, right? So you have to have a balance of membership and people who are drafting these standards from the producers and from the buyers, and also sort of what they call general interest, right? Which means ASTM standards, I think, because there is by individuals rather than sort of by organizations, tend to be a little bit more granular and more specific. There's a lot more detail in an ASTM standard. On the ISO side, and correct me if I'm wrong, these are standards that are developed by these delegations of folks from national standards bodies. So national standard bodies help to do that. So these are people that are sort of experts in their field that are, as a group, are coming to an agreement on what needs to be in the standard. But when it comes to balloting on the ASTM side, individuals, it's balloted to the whole entire membership, and the individuals can vote on that. So you as an individual can have an impact on what's in a standard. On the ISO side, it's one country, one vote, right? So what I've seen is, because of that, the ASTM one seems to be a lot more granular and more detailed, because you've got this feedback loop from all of the different parties sort of duking it out over what they want to see. And ASTM standards are also developed really to be focused on people that are procuring a service or a product, to help them understand. So it's more of an educational tool. Whereas on the ISO part, because of the way they're developed, and there's this one country, one vote thing, they are, I see them as higher level, but they both can work, right? So what I have found though is that it very much depends on who your audience is, and who your clients are, what they're gonna go. ASTM standards are international standards, but because it's a US based organization, a lot of people see them as US standards. That's not necessarily the case, but you know, they are international standards. But they do, like for example, one difference is how 17100 addresses credentialing, what qualifies a translator versus what's in the US in the ASTM standard, because of training and things that are available in those different markets. You're able to be much more, so in that area, ISO is much more specific. ASTM has to be a little bit fuzzier around the edges there, although it does adhere to what ISO says, but it gives you a little bit more room, because a lot of the languages that we're dealing with in the US in terms of what we have to provide our clients, particularly for languages that are for content that's consumed in the US, those trainings and things and credentialing aren't available for some languages. So you have to sort of move around those a little bit. So you do have to look at things from a locale perspective as well. Generally speaking, I think both standards work wherever, but it really comes down to the ISO standard 17100 is basically, this is what you need to do. This is what every project needs to include. ASTM, because of the market and sort of the way buyers interact with providers, it basically is, this is the template for you, to have a discussion with your provider about how to achieve, you know, what you're trying to achieve with the work that you're doing, and come to an agreement about how you're going to do the product. And basically, this is best practice. These are the risks involved in doing it this way, but you come to an agreement at the end in that specifications phase to decide what you're going to do and how you're going to provide the service. And if you provide the service per the specifications that you've agreed to up front, then you've provided the client the level of quality, will say, that is required to fit for purpose for their product. But you know, quality itself is never defined in the standard, and neither is it defined in any of the other standards, because quality is, you know, one man's quality is very different for somebody else. So it's all about sort of the process and what the ultimate end goals are. So in that regard, ASTM goes into a lot more detail because of how services are procured here versus what you see in in ISO 17100, it's a lot more prescriptive. You have to do this. This is the way, the way you need to do it. Whereas ASTM is like, these are the steps that you should follow to ensure that you get the best product you can. At the end of the day, they both work, and I think they both are, will allow a provider to provide an excellent product, but it's just the way the language is.
Yes, from that's totally right, Steve. In my experience in the international standards development process, because of the diversity of realities and participants, it might be more difficult to obtain consensus, and everything is consensus-based. Consensus not to be confused with the unanimity. It's very, very difficult in any setting to achieve unanimity, but maybe in the ASTM context, you may have people from different walks of life, but again, they are mostly all Americans, and they may even speak the same language and have similar interests. But
Exactly.
At the ISO level, you have jurisdictions that are, very different, and they may have different realities, and bringing everyone together and reaching consensus on industry specifics globally can be challenging sometimes, and that may explain why you are more likely to see general provisions at the ISO level to account for national differences.
Exactly.
And the way in which national standards treat national legislations treat international standards. Some international standards are automatically adopted in country legislation. In some other cases, it remains as voluntary industry regulation. So it is very tricky, but very passionate. And but just to sum up, there is definitely value in developing industry regulation, participating in that process, using that framework to improve your business and to leverage the resources you have. And again, from our experience at Megalexis, we can tell you the same. We embrace standards, and the experience is very positive from a client and business perspective, and from an internal perspective as well, in terms of training, in terms of documenting processes. So with that, I guess, since we are running out of time, I'm going to pass it on back to Pablo for the closing remarks, but not without thanking Pablo for this great opportunity. Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you, everybody. You used the word passionate, and this is what you were about. It was I'm in awe because of all I learned, and there are a lot of questions that I have, but we are just 1 minute away from finishing. Thank you, David, Steve, Liza, Julio. This has been very interesting. We have recorded this session, so we are going to be sharing the presentation with the people who couldn't make it today. Before finishing and getting to the last part of this, we are already preparing, and we are already working on the next tbotalent forum session that will be on July the 24th, and it will be Women in Charge. Jorgelina is sharing the link, and there will be this will be a very nice conversation that will include some of the top industry leaders and who happen to be women. We are going to be having Amy Ansari from Clear Global and Translators Without Borders, Karen Livermore Fisher, she's the previous president of Women in Localization, and we will have Ingrid Christensen. So get ready for it, and once again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Liza, Julio, Steve, David, and Jorgelina for being there. It's been a great session. We hope to see you all next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a nice one.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.